Before I move on, there are a few more points I'd like to make about the threat of imitation. In particular, there are a few points I'd like to make about how companies can protect their resource and capability advantages from imitation, and the sort of barriers to imitation that companies can erect around their resources and capabilities. Because imitation is not an instantaneous event. It's not something that just happens like that. Rather, imitation is a sequential, multi-step, multi-stage process that unfolds over time. And at each step in that process, there are conditions that need to be met in order for an imitation attempt to be successful. If those conditions are not met, then the attempt at imitation is effectively blocked. So let's talk about what are those steps and stages in the sequence of an imitation process, and what are the conditions that must be met at each stage in the process. I believe there are 5 conditions and 5 steps and stages that must be met successfully in order for an imitation to take place. First, the very most fundamental condition that must be met is recognition. The competitor must recognize that you have something that's worth imitating. They have to see that you're achieving superior performance, and have to recognize that there's something different about the way you're operating that is responsible for that superior performance. And in that recognition process, figure out that they want to imitate you. If they can't recognize that you have an advantage, or they can't recognize that you have superior performance, then they're not going to bother to try to imitate you at all. Second, there's the question of incentives. Even if a competitor recognizes that you're doing something differently, that is, creating superior performance for you, that competitor still has to have some incentive to actually go after imitating what you're doing. If the competitor figures that there's no benefit to them of imitating what you're doing, then they won't bother to do it. They won't have any incentive to do it if they figure that any attempt to imitate you is not going to generate any tangible benefit for them. They simply won't bother then, because they won't have any incentive. Third, they have to figure out exactly what it is that you're doing differently that's responsible for your superior performance. This is what we call diagnosis. They have to figure out why your performance is superior. What is it about what you're doing differently that is responsible for your superior performance? They have to diagnose that. And if they're unable to diagnose that, then their efforts at imitation are not going to be successful. They may imitate the wrong thing. Fourth, there's the question of resource acquisition. Because even if they recognize that you have an advantage that's causing superior performance, and even if they have an incentive to imitate that advantage, and even if they've correctly diagnosed what's causing that advantage, what resource advantage you have specifically that is responsible for your superior performance, they still must acquire the same resource, or a similar resource, or a substitute resource in order to imitate what you're doing. And if they are unable to acquire that same resource, or a similar resource, or a substitute resource, then they will not be successful at their attempt at imitation. So the resource acquisition stage is another stage in the process where imitation can be blocked. Finally, there is the deployment stage. A competitor can go through all 4 of these stages that we've already discussed. Recognition. They can see that you have an advantage. They can have an incentive to imitate you. They can diagnose what it is that you're doing differently that's responsible for your superior performance. They can acquire those resources, and they can still be blocked from imitation at the deployment stage. If they are not able to deploy that resource that they're imitating as effectively as you are able to deploy it, then they will not be successful in their imitation. So let's talk about what are the barriers to imitation that can occur at each of these 5 steps in the process. To illustrate these barriers to imitation, I want to use the example of Southwest Airlines, which I discussed briefly earlier, because Southwest, I think, is a great example of a company whose resource advantages are really extremely well protected against imitation at all 5 stages of this process. First, at the recognition stage, what can the company do to create a barrier to imitation at the recognition stage? It can hide its superior performance so that competitors don't recognize that it is a superior performer or don't recognize it as having an advantage that's worth imitating. Well, part of this is that competitors have to recognize it as a competitor. Competitors have to recognize you as a competitor. And often, companies don't think about their competitors broadly enough to recognize you as a competitor. It may be possible that that they are defining their competition so narrowly as only being the other companies that are very similar to itself, serving the same market that it's serving, and the same customers in the same sort of way. And if they define competition that narrowly, then they may miss the fact that that there is another competitor out there who has something worth imitating. So, for example, this is what I believe has happened, at least initially, in the case of Southwest Airlines, because I think it would have been very difficult for the major hub and spoke airlines in the United States to recognize Southwest as a threat initially at the early stages. Why is that? Because Southwest competed so differently than these other airlines that they may not have recognized Southwest as a competitor, as a threat. And so they may not have paid any attention to Southwest, or at least not as much attention as they should have. Why is that? Because whereas they were competing as broad market competitors trying to serve every flyer in the United States through their hub and spoke system, Southwest was a narrow niche player who focused on hub bypass routes between secondary cities and secondary airports in major cities. And so because Southwest was competing in a different market for different competitors in a different way, applying different resources, and Southwest looked so different than the major airlines might not have recognized Southwest as a threat, as a competitor, as a company that had anything that was worth imitating. So that's a stage at which I think Southwest was, perhaps not anymore, well, certainly not anymore, but initially Southwest had been protected in the early stages from recognition of its advantage because it was just competing so differently. Secondly, what about the incentive stage? What sort of barriers to imitation can a company build at the incentive stage? Well, I think there are 2 types. First, there's deterrence. And here we're talking about what we referred to earlier in the course as strategic barriers to entry. That is, threats to punish imitators. This threat might take place in the form of, it might not be a verbal threat, don't get me wrong there. Threats can take place in many different ways. It could be the building of massive amounts of excess capacity. And so when the incumbent company has a massive amount of excess capacity, that gives it a strong incentive to fight a price war with any potential imitator, with any potential entrant. So any imitator seeing that, a potential imitator seeing that, says, you know, I don't want to get involved in a fight with a company that has that much excess capacity, because they're going to be committed to fighting it out, and I'm not going to win. So that's a form of entry deterrence, of deterrence to imitation. Another form of deterrence to imitation would be limit pricing. That is, holding your prices so low that any imitator that tries to do what you're doing, that tries to imitate your strategy, will recognize that, hey, it ain't worth it. There's no way I'm going to make much profit out of doing this kind of imitation, because these guys who are already in there doing this are charging such a low price that I can't possibly charge a high enough price to recoup my investment in this imitation exercise. The second way that a company can reduce the incentive for a competitor to imitate its resources and capabilities is preemption. And this is more of a structural barrier in terms of the language we used earlier in the course. And here what I have in mind is locking up all of the profitable uses of the resource. Now, this might mean locking up all of the markets where that resource can be used, or it might mean locking up all of the complementary resources that need to be employed in conjunction with this resource in order for that resource to be effective. Because in general, resources do not work in a vacuum. In order to be effective, resources need other resources to work with, in combination with. And if you have locked up all of the other complementary resources that are required in order to get the most out of a given resource, then there's no way that anybody's going to try to imitate that resource because you've already preempted all the profitable uses for it. So how does all of this apply to the Southwest Airlines example? Where are the barriers to imitation at the incentive stage in the Southwest Airlines example? Well, I think there are both deterrence and preemption types of barriers to imitation in the Southwest Airlines example. Let me start with the preemption. Southwest Airlines has basically locked up all of the routes where its particular business model would be successful. Remember that Southwest is serving city pair markets where the origin and destination cities are secondary cities, smaller cities for the most part, or large cities with secondary smaller airports. And so these are markets, especially between the secondary cities, these are markets that are small markets. They're markets that are just large enough to have enough demand for one nonstop airline serving that market. But they're not big enough to support two nonstop airlines serving that market. So they have basically preempted all the profitable routes where their model of business, where the Southwest business model of being an airline can work. The second thing that they've done is a deterrence type of thing. They keep their prices low. In these markets, they keep their prices low enough that nobody's going to follow them into these markets. Nobody has any incentive to bother to imitate the Southwest example and go into these secondary hub bypass markets because Southwest is charging such a low price on those markets that it wouldn't be profitable for them to do so. So Southwest is protected at this incentive stage both in a preemption sense, in a structural sense, and also in a deterrence or strategic sense. Let's talk about what are the barriers to imitation at the diagnosis phase. Here, the piece of jargon that I want to use is causal ambiguity. What does that mean? It means if there is some ambiguity about what's causing your advantage. Which resource is it that you have that is causing your advantage? If the answer to that question is ambiguous, then that's what we call causal ambiguity. So, for example, if a company's competitive advantage is based not on a single resource, but on multiple resources, then it may be difficult for competitors to figure out which one or which ones of those resources is responsible for the superior performance.